Hi, it's Steve Smith here again, and this is the second of my CPD presentations, continual professional development presentations, and this one's still focused on listening. Now, in the first session, we did a general introduction to the process approach to listening, and we're going to follow up on that with a focus on phonology and phonics. And this material is just a little taster of our book, the book I wrote with Gianfranco Conti called Breaking the Sound Barrier, Teaching Language Learners How to Listen. Just before we get going, so there's my Twitter handle, spsmith45. You can also find me on my blog, frenchteachernet.blogspot.com. And also, I'd recommend to you the links website I set up a while ago called informedlanguageteacher.com, which has got readings associated with research on all sorts of topics. So here we go then. This is the process approach to listening, part 2. Now, when we look at how we listen, this is just a reminder of a table I showed in the first session from John Field, and if you can just see that there on the left hand side, we've got these separate skills that are required when students listen. So they need to understand things at the phonemic level, the sound level, the level of syllables, words and phrases, syntax, that's the grammar of the sentence, and also a grasp of the intonation of the language they hear. And obviously breaking down the stream of sound is an extremely complex thing to do, and often our students do incredibly well, but we know that some of them struggle. Now, the idea behind the process approach is this: can we break down the process of listening and then design activities which focus on each of these levels? So, for example, could we do exercises that focus on the level of phonemes and phonics? Could we do exercises that focus on syllables, words, and so on? So each of these separate skills we could call micro skills or sub-skills. And so a micro skill approach is the process approach to listening. I mean, in the book we call it listening as modeling, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. So that's just to recap something from the previous presentation. Now, just as a little aside, but you'll see why this is relevant here, I just wanted to show you here the classic model of working memory. This is the model associated with this fellow on the right called Alan Badley. There are other models out there, but they have a lot of things in common, and it's worth dwelling on this just for a second so that you can put this work on listening into context. So when we hear stuff, it's the input over here. It goes into our sensory memory, what's called the sensory memory, which is really unconscious. And we decide what to pay attention to. In the model of working memory here, our central executive is what focuses our attention on what interests us. And then, crucially, we have down here what's called the phonological loop. Now, this is what processes sounds and words and all the language that we hear. And so when we hear something, it's held in our working memory in the phonological loop. Now, some of this material from the phonological loop could, in the end, find its way into our long-term memory, which is where we want it to be. Now, if we don't know how to pronounce words well, if we don't have a clear phonological memory of what they sound like, then anything that goes into long-term memory may be faulty. It may be that if we've just read words, for example, we might have an idea of what they look like, but we can't be certain what they sound like. Ideally, if we have what they sound like in a phonological form in long-term memory, then when we listen, we're more likely to recognize those sounds and words and phrases when we hear them. So this is a fundamental argument for focusing on pronunciation, on reading aloud, on a clear understanding of the relationship between sounds and words. So that's why the background in working memory is important. If we let students develop poor pronunciation or don't really work on it rigorously, there's a danger that they won't have a solid enough store of good phonological long-term memory, which is what we really need when we need to retrieve words quickly. So that's just a little bit of background there on the importance of phonics, phonology, and long-term memory. So we know from the models of working memory that words and chunks are stored in various ways, including phonologically. Therefore, it's important then to sum up that students can pronounce well, and so hence the stress on phonics and reading aloud. And if we want students to understand and process the language that they hear, then we need to watch out for the cognitive load. There's no point in giving them lots of language which they can't understand. Effectively, it's gobbledygook, so it needs to be language that they can really understand. Hence, the focus always on this idea of comprehensible input and the importance of comprehensible target language. So, to build up the confident listeners we were talking about in the first presentation, then, a key thing here is to watch cognitive load, keep language as comprehensible as possible. Now, I'm going to get into just one or two examples of activities you can do in the classroom which focus on phonics and phonology. This, I have to say, is just a tiny sample of the many that we've got. I think it's in chapter 3 of our book. We've got something like 45 separate classroom activities focused just on phonetics and phonology and phonics. But here's the first one, minimal pair practice. Some of you will know what minimal pairs are, but in case you don't, it's the classic thing where one sound in a word changes the meaning. So for learners of English, if you're learning the words ship up here and sheep, so if you're a French person learning those two words, that's a real tricky distinction, because in French there's no distinction between the phonemes I and E, ship, sheep. So that's an example of a minimal pair. So this is quite good for working on both phonics and phonology. So if you simply display on the board two words which are near homophones, i.e. they're very similar in pronunciation, read one of the two out and students have to spot which of the two you uttered. With all these sorts of activities, often they're little fillers that you can put into lessons, and I wouldn't suggest filling a lesson with activities like these, but little bits of pieces like this, particularly for beginners, build up this sort of awareness of sound and also a sense of having fun with sounds. Here's some examples of minimal pairs. French on the left, German in the middle, Spanish on the right. So in French, which is my language, we've got blanc, blond, vin, vent, déjà, déjà, and then so on. So these are very easy to come up with, and you can put pairs on the board and have fun with those. We often teach the alphabet to students, beginners, and I always had doubts about doing the alphabet because I thought, well, actually being able to spell words in itself, it has a use, but it's not incredibly productive in terms of language acquisition. But actually, you can use the alphabet really with a different aim in mind, and that's to develop awareness of sound. So you'll have your favorite alphabet fun activities, I guess, with your beginners. But there's a list of them there on the left. My own favourite was I think it was the US Army marching song, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but you can try other tunes. Camptown Races works well, so does Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and for people who live in the UK, EastEnders apparently works. Sometimes you have to tweak these a little bit. Another favourite of mine was to get children to guess the word first as it's spelt out. So again, they're hearing nice accurate pronunciations of individual phonemes. Incidentally, if you get students to do chanting activities, for example, when they walk into the classroom, the only thing I'd say about that is if you're going to do it, just do it really well. So if they come into a classroom and they pronounce these phonemes very lazily, I'm not sure that's the best use of time. And so I think really keep on top of them and do your best to make sure that they're being really fussy about accurate pronunciation. So we don't want them saying, for example, in French, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's not going to be much use for phonological awareness. So we want to really stress the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and get them to move their lips, watch your lips, maybe use gestures to help and so on. YouTube songs are great, and an optician's sight testing chart is sometimes being suggested as a fun way just to get children to look at letters and have fun with sounds. If we look at pupils' awareness of decoding errors. This is an exercise designed by Gianfranco Conti, which he calls faulty echo. And in this one, then, you display a list of words or short chunks featuring perhaps the sounds you want to focus on. Then you read one of them aloud correctly, as clearly as possible. Then you read the same item a second time, pronouncing it wrongly. So you want to focus on particular problem areas perhaps, and students have to spot the sound you mispronounced, and then that becomes the source of a discussion to do with sound and articulation. Slight caveat for that one, of course. Danger is, some of you might be thinking, as soon as you present something that is faulty next to something that is accurate, the danger is that what might end up in long-term memory is the faulty one. So there's a potential area of confusion. So I think when you do exercises which involve spotting errors, probably best to do it at the stage where you think that the students have already internalized quite successfully the correct sound. So if they've got in long-term memory a good phonological memory of a certain sound, and then you then test it against a mistake, that's more likely to reinforce the correct version of the sound. Do you see what I mean? And here's another one from our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. This one, spot the correct transcription. So in this case, it's a French example. You give pupils a gapped version of a sentence, and then you give them 3 near homophones. Then read out the sentence at a reasonably natural speed, and students choose the correct option. So the teacher would say, j'y vais avec lui, I'm going with him, or I'm going there with him. Students see on the board, j'y vais avec, and then they've got 3 options, lui, lui, l'huile. And they've got to spot the right one, which was lui. So very doable, accessible activities with a focus on phonology and phonics and building up sound awareness. I just want to throw in at this point a reference to one approach that's being used in quite a lot of schools, certainly in England at the moment. And it's the idea of using what's called a knowledge organizer to practice reading aloud and phonics. So this is a little extract from one that was shared with me from Michaela Community School in London. And so in their knowledge organizer books, they have on the left English phrases and on the right French ones, or at least in part of their knowledge organizer books, that's what you see. And then they do a match here, a sort of bilingual approach to phonics, where you've got something in bold there, and you've got not just the word, but also a coding system to show where there are tricky combinations of letters matched to sounds. So in French, for example, that verb faire, now an English reader might be tempted to pronounce that as A, because when they see AI, they think of the sound A, perhaps, as in made or laid or whatever it might be. So they need to learn that sound is faire. And so anything where there's a potential problem has a coding system. Another one here is OI, which is, to an English learner, likely to be oi, but of course in French it's wa. And then we've got silent letters, which are also indicated there, mes, devoir. So they systematically, with their beginners, do lots of choral reading aloud, individual reading aloud, with a focus on phonics. And I have to say the results are pretty amazing, and I've seen them firsthand, and I've seen the exam results the school gets. And I think schools that have gone for this phonics approach certainly get children who can pronounce really well. And because of what we said about working memory earlier on, then it's likely that they're going to have a good phonological representation of words in their long-term memory. And that helps with listening. Okay, so that's the knowledge organizer sort of approach. You'll find examples of those online. There's even on one of the Facebook professional groups, a group specifically devoted to knowledge organizers. The sentence builder approach is also very popular at the moment, and this has been strongly championed by Gianfranco Conti, by myself more recently, and other teachers as well. And this is the old-fashioned sort of substitution table where we've got language broken down into chunks. In this case, again, it's a French one about food and drink. So you have a chunk here, j'aime manger, and then we've got what people like to eat and other items, and so it goes on. So you have the potential to build up a sentence or more with chunks, and you sort of slot into each of these columns the words that you want to put in. Now, the point for phonology and phonics here is if you design a sentence builder, you can build in codes or particular to highlight the text where, for example, here we've got silent letters, les pâtes, les frites. Over here, je n'aime pas trop. So you can build in phonics there. But when you look at the sort of activities you can do with a sentence builder, a lot of them can involve phonological awareness and phonics. By the way, I'll come back to that in another presentation and give you a suggested teaching sequence on exactly how you can use a sentence builder. The other thing you can do, of course, is to take the traditional written text, and then what can you do with phonetics and phonology around that? Well, here's a little text that I put together some time ago. It was actually aimed at more or less beginners, but probably good for, say, 2 or maybe 3 years of work. So it's a text about meerkats. Just scan through to start with, and you'll see, even if you're not a French reader, you'll understand quite a bit there because of the large number of cognates in the text. So we've got, for example, words like mesure, centimètre, insecte, rat, reptile, bulbe, plant, and so on. So lots of help there that makes an interesting little text accessible to younger learners. So I think when you choose your text, that's a key point to bear in mind. But the point here on phonetics, phonology, and so on is that, what would you actually do with that text with a focus on phonology? Well, one thing I think is certainly choral reading aloud. So to get students to read phrase by phrase out loud following your model. Including in that, you can use the familiar sort of back-chaining effect. That's the one where, for example, if you get students to repeat the word centimètre, you then get them to say être, mètre, imètre, timètre, antimètre, centimètre. It's interesting how students enjoy doing back-chaining. I'm never quite sure why they prefer back-chaining to forward-chaining, but back-chaining seems to be the thing that teachers do and that works well. So lots of reading aloud to give students confidence at hearing the words first and then having a go at pronouncing them in an unthreatening sort of context. And then as soon as you think the group is ready, then you could add individuals reading aloud or paired reading aloud and so on. And I've used the technique of what's in the jargon called input enhancement here, and that's just to pick out certain tricky sounds where there are potential errors. So the word souris, meaning mice, souris clearly is a problem area for students because they've got to deal not only with the OU, the OU, but also the silent S at the end, not to mention the uvular R in the middle, souris. Then we've got this very tricky oiseau, E-A-U-X. Imagine a young learner coming at that without much experience. So that just needs lots and lots of practice. And I've done the same for other tricky words and endings lower down. So we've got reading aloud, we've got choral reading aloud, we've got paired reading aloud. Students could read aloud with fingers in their ears, for example, a technique I observed also at Michaela School, by the way. And so I think lots and lots of good reading aloud. And then when you've got a text like that and you've worked on it for a while, and there's all sorts of exercises you could do with this, but I just want to focus on one, and that's what we call in the book disappearing text. But actually, there's nothing new about this. It's the sort of thing where once you've worked on your text for a while, you simply take some language away bit by bit, and then students have to reproduce with you. So let's say the students have seen this text here, it's on the board, and then you read aloud, Le suricate mesure de 26 à 38, and hopefully you're thinking centimètres. And the students would call out centimètre or put up their hands and so on. And so you can work through that. That's your first version of disappearing text. And then the next version on the next slide, you could then take away more, produce more gaps rather, and students again have to use their short-term memory to see how much they can remember. Actually, in my experience, students enjoy these short-term memory challenges. They're doable, they give confidence, and again, they produce lots of target language repetition. Just think, if your challenge is how do I use target language in the classroom, this sort of activity is a way that just builds it in naturally and gives lots of input, lots of repetition. So the great thing about disappearing text is you can tailor-make it to the class as well. So if you've got a very highly proficient, high-attaining sort of group, you take away more text. If the group are struggling a bit more, then you could give them more text and take away less. And one or two details here, if you look at the fine detail, take a word like this one, which was nourriture. So there I've chosen to give the first syllable, nous, as if nous primes them for the rest of the word. That makes it much easier than just putting an N in. As soon as they've got nous, hopefully in their brains they would have already stored nourriture. So there we're working at the syllable level as well. Some further reading just to finish off this short presentation. A reminder about John Field's book. And one or two links which come from my site called Informed Language Teacher. Very good video by Paul Merritt about the phonological loop if you want to see more about that. It's quite short, very accessible. One of the top experts from the scholarly world of listening is Larry van der Grift, and there's a nice article of his, and I've given you the link there. And just to finish off this presentation, number 2, that's our book on the left, Breaking the Sound Barrier, which I would recommend to you. I've just given you the tip of the iceberg, really, in this presentation today, but there's lots more to read, lots more examples. And there's the John Field book. The John Field book, by the way, is really good. It's an academic book. It's meticulous. It's detailed. It has some examples of classroom practice, but it's really more of a very detailed description about how the listening process works in the first language and second language, and why, therefore, there's a case for the process model of listening rather than the product or comprehension model of listening. So that's the end of today's session. The next one will still focus on listening, but we're going to move up that hierarchy of micro skills away from phonological processing to lexical retrieval and grammatical parsing. So how can we design exercises that get students focused on retrieving words and chunks from long-term memory, and how to parse sentences, i.e. use the grammar of the sentence to work out meaning. So I hope that's been useful for you. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll hope you look at my other presentations in due course. Bye.